Hi, tax attorney John Hyre here, and going through a few more questions just for a frame of reference. I used to have something called the inner circle. We used to take questions and do a good deal more besides. So I thought I'd give you a sample. We're restarting it, and so we're taking a bunch of questions and posting them. So we'll get started. So we've got somebody, they own a condo. It's 85% owned by their traditional IRA and 15% owned by them. So it's jointly owned between their IRA and themselves. They're going to sell that condo. They have another condo. This person, Victor, owns the condo on his own. He's going to sell both of these, and then they're going to purchase a duplex in Raleigh. So both condos, one is mostly owned by an IRA, one is owned by him. Both are going to sell. They're going to be used to purchase a condo in Raleigh. And his question is, am I able to structure it so I can use half the condo? I want to be there. When I visit family in North Carolina, I want to be in half of it. Can I do that? And you've got two issues that stand in the way of it. The first one is you can never use IRA assets for personal benefit. Using a duplex that the condo owns a percentage of is using the duplex for personal benefit. So I would say if you're going to be conservative about this, I just wouldn't go near it, because what happens when you have a prohibited transaction in an IRA? The entire IRA dies. I might be a little calmer about it for a 401k. The prohibited transaction penalties on a 401k are lower. Now, we can argue that the duplex is really two properties. We could report it separately. We could report half the duplex as a rental on Schedule E, and we could report half the duplex as purely personal. Or as a rental, we'll talk about why that may not work on the second half, but report the first half, the half owned by the IRA, as being the rental, and that you never use it, ever, not even for one evening, personally. And you use the other half of the duplex, but you report it as two separate properties on your 1040. Could that work? It's a theory. The problem is if you're wrong, you've got a prohibited transaction and it destroys the IRA, everything gets distributed and penalized. That's not a lot of fun. If you're going to do it, I'm leaning away from it. I don't like it. I think there's too much potential for a prohibited transaction that the IRS just comes back and says, a duplex is a duplex. Your traditional IRA owns some of it. You use it. You're done. Might they buy the idea, if you're going to do it, that the duplex is really two properties and you've treated it as two properties? That's if you were to do this, that's how I would do it. It would reduce the risk. Maybe an IRS auditor buys the agreement, or if we end up in tax court, they don't really want to litigate something that gray, and they give you a settlement you can live with. Bear in mind that even if that works, the side that you live in, if you're going to be in it for more than 14 days, if it's going to be used as a personal residence for 14 days, and the context here indicates it shall be, then you're not going to be able to take a net loss on it as a rental. Code section 280 cap A says, if you use a building that is being, for example, rented for more than 14 days of personal use, any net loss for that year is just disallowed. So if you have too much personal use, then that portion, even if you rent it out some, you can deduct rental expenses against rental income and drive the rental income to zero, but you can't go below zero and take a loss. The fact that you're residing in it means no loss. And so be aware of that issue if you intend to rent it out some. Now, if you're just going to use that side as purely a residence, you're not even going to bother to try to rent it out at all, then that portion is not a problem. You've accepted that there's not going to be a rental. The 14 days doesn't matter because you're treating it as 100% residence. What I would then do, if you choose to go through with this, is treat the IRA half, that is 85% IRA, 15% you. And actually the money comes out a little differently, because if you look at the values of the condos, your ownership will be a little higher. I would treat that half as a rental property and make a clear disclosure on the return that this is what you're doing. Again, would I do it if it were me? No. Might I do it if this were a traditional 401k? If I moved my money from the IRA to the 401k? Yeah, the prohibited transaction penalty is much lower, right? What would the penalty be? It would be a percentage of the rent you would have paid to have stayed there times 15%. Now that stacks. The problem is that can get very high over the years. given how the 15% penalty is cumulative. So let's say, I'm just making up a number now. Let's say the penalty in year one, if you have this in a 401k, is $4,000, 15% of whatever the rent would have been, $4,000. In year two, you now pay 15% on $8,000. You have the $4,000 from year one, and you have the $4,000 from year two. And then in year three, you pay the penalty on $12,000. In other words, it keeps accumulating and snowballing, which can become quite a heavy number. By and large, I really prefer you not do this. But if you must do it, I would structure it as a 401k instead of an IRA. If you're going to do it as an IRA, I would make sure this is the only asset in the IRA. So if it blows up, it doesn't take anything else with it. It'd probably be the last one I ever convert to Roth. Why convert something to Roth that may be blown up by a prohibited transaction? But I would roll the interest into a traditional 401k. I would treat, and I wonder if there's paperwork on closing. You know, I don't know how it works in North Carolina. I'd go to the title people and say, listen, I don't want an undivided interest ownership. I want to find a way, if possible, to structure the deed so the IRS or the IRA or the 401k actually owns the side in which I never reside. I wonder if there's a deed format where they could have, for example, two separate deeds for the thing, but not as tenants in common. Because if you have a deed with tenants in common on a duplex, the IRA is considered to own a piece of the whole duplex. That doesn't work for you. You need the IRA, or better yet, the 401k, to be considered to own just a portion of the duplex. Now, I've never heard of such an arrangement in terms of title holding, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Because if you can define that the IRA or 401k does not own the part you sleep in, then I think this becomes a lot more viable. So I would talk to a title company, and I would want a pretty solid answer. Given what's at stake here, I don't know that I would want them hemming and hawing. I would want a clear solution under local law that allows me to isolate the ownership of the IRA based on local law. If you can't do that, even with a 401k, I tend to not want to do this. If you decide you're going to do it, if it's in an IRA still, then I would make sure to have that IRA own nothing more than this interest. If you do it in a 401k, I would report the penalty every year. The penalty is going to add up at some point. It's going to get ugly, that penalty, if you see how it snowballs over time. So I might take a year off and not use it, and that cures the problem. And then you start it over again if you continue to do it. Granted, the IRS might come back and say, well, 1 year off doesn't cure the problem. That's a subjective argument. So we have a lot of gray here, a lot of subjectivity, and some fairly harsh consequences if you're wrong. My inclination is don't do it. I talk to you about how to do it if you must do it.